Static posture assessment. The anterior view of the client's static posture does not reveal much as far as anterior pelvic tilt is concerned. However, we can start to see that the abdominals are on stretch and may be weakened from this view. As we can clearly see during the lateral portion of the static posture assessment, this client has severe anterior pelvic tilt. He presents with lower cross syndrome and clearly has tight hip flexors and spinal erectors while having weak abdominals and glutes. During the posterior postural assessment, we can further see how tight the spinal erectors are in relation to the weak glutes, which are contributing to the client's anterior pelvic tilt. Range of motion assessment. During the range of motion assessment for hip flexion, the client had 105 degrees for the right leg and 101 degrees for the left leg. These are both below the normal goniometric measurements for hip flexion, which is listed at 120 degrees of flexion at the hip. The range of motion assessment for hip extension revealed the right hip had negative 15 degrees and left hip had negative 19 degrees of hip extension, both surpassing the normal range of motion of negative 10 degrees of hip extension. Manual muscle tests. The manual muscle tests seen here were used to assess hip extension strength. During these tests, it was revealed that the client has poor hip extension strength and abdominal strength due to the hyperextension of the back before going into hip extension with either leg. Movement assessment. The overhead squat movement assessment revealed that the client has a severe hyperextension of the lumbar spine due to the anterior pelvic tilt. The client has weak glutes and abdominals as well as tight hip flexors, and thus he compensates with his low back and spinal erectors. He has a slight forward lean as well, most likely due to a tight gastrocnemius. Inhibitory phase. Here the client uses self-myofascial release to roll out his tensor fasciae latae. The client uses self-myofascial release with the foam roller to roll out his latissimus dorsi. Here the client uses self-myofascial release with the foam roller to roll out his quadriceps group. The client uses self-myofascial release with the foam roller to roll out his gastrocnemius. Here the client uses self-myofascial release with the foam roller to roll out his adductors. Lengthening phase. Here the client uses a static stretch of the latissimus dorsi. The client uses a static stretch of the hip flexors, particularly targeting the tensor fascia latae with this stretch. Here the client uses a static stretch of the gastrocnemius. Here the client uses a static stretch targeting the spinal erectors. Activation phase. Here the client is performing planks to primarily activate the abdominals as well as getting some glute activation. Here the client is performing glute bridges where he will be targeting activation of the glutes while maintaining a rigid core and going through a full range of motion, primarily targeting the glutes. Here the client is performing an exercise known as bird dogs. The exercise has the client raising and extending his left arm with right leg and right arm with left leg. During the exercise, the core stays tight and the glutes drive his hip and leg into extension while activating the core and abdominals. Here are the sets and reps for each exercise during the activation phase. Integration phase. Here the client is performing stability ball wall squats. With stability ball on back between yourself and the wall, squat down slowly as far as your range of motion allows, while keeping a neutral spine and back on the ball. Slowly stand by bringing hips and knees into extension. Repeat for reps. Here the client is performing kettlebell goblet squats. Holding a light kettlebell by the horns close to your chest, squat down between your legs until your hamstrings are on your calves, or as deep as your range of motion allows. Keep your chest and head up and your back straight. At the bottom position, pause and then return to the starting position by bringing hips and knees into extension.